Hello everyone, my name is Nick, and this week's plant of the week is Peperomia scandens Variegata. Can't tell you how many takes I've done so far where I've introduced this as a philodendron scandens, which makes so much sense because this really does look so much like a philodendron scandens or a philodendron heteroecium, the standard Hartley philodendron. And because of that, this is, oh, hello, sweet pea, really coming in aggressively there. Because of that, this is often referred to as the philodendron peperomia, the trailing peperomia, the scandent peperomia. However, this is always called Peperomia scandens, but I know like philodendron scandens is an incorrect name, so I wouldn't be surprised if Peperomia scandens is an incorrect name as well. I should have did a little bit more research about that myself, but this is what you're always going to see this plant listed as if you're going to a houseplant store. This is what it's going to be called. And this has really earned its way as a common peperomia now. I feel like you'll walk into most houseplant stores these days and you're going to find Peperomia scandens available, which just a year or two ago, that wouldn't have been the case, but it just started to work its way into cultivation, or mass cultivation more so, a couple of years ago. And now I think it's going to be one you're going to find at practically every houseplant store amongst the Peperomia obtusifolias and the caparatas and all those peperomias that you would have found in the houseplant stores 5 years ago. So I think that's rather exciting. And there are a couple of different varieties of this houseplant. Of course, I'm just talking about the standard variegated one today with the variegation going around the outsides of the leaves, but there are so many different cultivated varieties that are appearing on the market, from just the plain green to silver to there's like ones with flecks on them. There's so many different varieties, but this one and the plain green are certainly the most prevalent ones you're going to find at your houseplant stores. Fortunately, I would say that this is like the easiest peperomia to care for, at least in my own opinion and experience. But this one just trails nonstop. It continuously is growing. It's constantly putting out new growth from the base. So you're going to see that there is a bunch of vines on this pretty clearly. But if we look inside the planter, which is going to be very difficult to see from the angle that we're at, so I will just tell you and give you a close-up that there are only 3 plants planted inside this planter here, but they are constantly growing and they'll kind of max out around like 2 feet or so. And then after they are finished putting off growth in this one section of the plant, from the base of the plant, they'll put off a new vine and then another one and another one. And that's how your peperomia start off from such small houseplants to begin, but over a couple years, they really do explode into much larger plants, very different than like philodendrons, which will just continuously grow from like one vine unless you propagate it. This is constantly producing more and more, and it looks quadruple the size when I first purchased it. And these are very lackadaisical too in terms of care. Like I said, I would consider them to be like the easiest peperomias out there. For the lighting, I have mine growing like 6 to 8 feet away from an east-facing window. I also have my green scandens basically the same exact distance away. And I think this could grow fine closer to the window, it could grow fine further away from the window. The one thing about these leaves, at least on my scandens, they're all a little bit more thin. Like I couldn't practice my taco test that I always talk about for peperomias on Peperomia scandens because these leaves are just already paper thin. So I feel like if this was in a bright window, like a south or west facing window, these leaves would probably burn. I wouldn't recommend putting it there, but an east or north facing window would be fine. But like I said, mine's pulled back quite a bit from an east-facing window, and I would say it's absolutely flourishing. And speaking of the leaves being a little bit more thin, I'm watering this a little bit more often. In fact, I would say I can't keep up with watering this. It's inside a ceramic planter, and I literally don't think I water this enough. When I go around with the watering can weekly, I feel like this is already kind of limp and always asking for more water. So, of course, it depends. Maybe my soil is a little bit depleted since I've had it for a couple years now, so maybe it's drying out quicker, but it is bone dry right now. I can tell you that it needs a good shower after we are done filming today's video. And the soil is just like a standard peperomia mix, which is just, for me, like a standard like store-bought peat or coconut coir-based mix that I'll add some orchid bark and some perlite into, or some pumice or volcanic rock or something to make the mixture a little bit more coarse, as the way that these grow in their natural habitats are growing in much more like rockier and loose soils, so you don't want this in a heavy peat-based soil. And even though I mentioned with the watering with this that I'm watering this often, I still think if you were to keep this soil wet and you weren't letting it dry out, this would probably, it would rot, as this is still a peperomia. I don't think it's free of the root rot issues that peperomias can succumb to if you water them a little too often. So while I'm just trying to drive home here, I am watering this definitely more often than any of the other peperomias that I have in my home, but that does not mean that you can't overwater this houseplant. I would still be very wary of that. I do not fertilize my peperomias very often. They're pretty light feeders across the board. However, I do tend to leave my peperomias be in the same planter for years to come. So this has been living inside this planter now for a full year. I think I've had this for like a year and a half. So it's lived throughout a full like spring and summer inside this planter. So now that it's been inside the same soil, the nutrients are probably a little bit more depleted. I should consider fertilizing this at least twice during these spring and summer months, but just a light fertilizer. I'll just use a standard houseplant fertilizer, and I always cut that in half because it's always best to use less fertilizer than more. Less is always more. It might sound like you might be pumping your plants up full of nutrients, but it can actually cause the leaves to burn and they will not recover from that burning. So you, of course, want your houseplants to look the very best that they can possibly be. Peperomias do prefer higher humidity, but as this is a more common, easy to grow peperomia, I don't think that's going to be an issue. Ideally, this would love humidity that's like 60% or above, but this will do perfectly fine in 40 to 60% humidity, which is typically what we're working with in our homes in the winter months. That can fall below when the heat kicks on. I haven't personally had an issue with that, but these leaves are pretty thin, so I could imagine if this was very close to like a heating system or something that's really sapping the moisture out of the air, I could imagine that being an issue. You will see that there are some like yellow leaves on my plant. I think they're not like yellow, they're just like kind of like looking very tired. I think that is probably because, like I said, I don't seem like I can water this houseplant enough. Every time I get to it with the watering can, it's already bone dry, and I just am still, I guess, figuring out how often I need to water this, even though it's obviously growing fantastically for me. So it's definitely very drought tolerant, but I feel like that inconsistency of the watering and allowing it to dry out a little too much is what's causing these leaves to turn yellow right here. And then for the temperature, peperomias don't like drafts, so this isn't going to do well below 50 degrees, 55 degrees, let's say. And this is going to thrive, certainly, in just like standard household temperature, probably like 65 to 75, 80 degrees. Will do totally fine. The one thing I love about peperomias, well, I mean, I love a lot of things about peperomias, of course, you all know that, but one of the best things about peperomias is that they are pet friendly, they are non-toxic to animals, to humans. They are not edible because they don't taste good, I would assume, but this is completely non-toxic. So if you do have any animals or nippy children, I would not have to worry twice about that. In fact, if you do have the issue, there are like 1,000 peperomia varieties out there. So you can totally suffice with an indoor garden full of peperomia if that is the case. I think that's going to do it. Oh, propagation. I did not talk about propagation. So peperomias, you can propagate them from one single leaf with just the petiole, as long as it's inside like water, sphagnum moss. I will usually just take like takeout containers, like those ones that have like the black plastic on the bottom and then the clear lid on top, if you guys know what I'm talking about. You could even just use Tupperware if you have that, a spare Tupperware, and you can just fill it up with a light layer of substrate, whether it be moss, vermiculite. I usually just use soil because it's just the easiest thing to use, and I'll of course use a mixture that's more amended towards the plants that I'm propagating. And you can just put a bunch of those single leaf cuttings, as long as that petiole is submerged in the soil substrate. These will root up, and the humidity of keeping it inside the Tupperware or the takeout container is going to basically give it greenhouse conditions. And beyond that, if like you have a chunk of these vines fall off, you can just put them inside a little jar of water, like typical water propagation, like you would do with just a standard golden pothos vine. And as long as you have a node submerged in the water, which these nodes I think are pretty similar to philodendrons and pothos, which they already have that little tiny little root nublet coming out of the node. They're already signifying that it is looking to root into something. Basically, because this, as it's a scandent plant, it's creeping along the surface of wherever it's growing, and this would be constantly rooting into the surface. So that's kind of how this translates. But now I think I've covered all the bases for this wonderful houseplant, Peperomia scandens variegata. Definitely don't think this houseplant gets enough attention. It's a super cool houseplant, but I think some of those other trailing philodendrons and Hoyas and all those doodads I think get a little bit more attention, but as this is, in most cases, a very inexpensive houseplant, It's definitely one that you shouldn't be passing over. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Philly Foliage. You can subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like. And I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.